Australia proudly claims to be one of the oldest continuing democracies in the world. A nation founded as a dumping ground for convicts has grown up proclaiming the tradition of the fair go, a country where the rule of law and the right to free speech protects all. But there is a dark side to this utopian dream. Those who have found the courage to speak out against wrongs and corruption have found Australia a very lonely place.
I was witness to some of the greatest official misconduct in this country's history.
No government wants freedom of information. Why would they? It merely exposes either their culpable incompetence or outright corruption.
When all other avenues have been exhausted, we have and should have the right to contact the media.
This is a series about people who took a stand, whistleblowers, those who challenged more than just a system, but also a state of mind, and made a difference to the land of the fair go. For them, Australia has not been a land of law and order, but a land of law and disorder. In 2003, the US government led a 4-nation invasion force to invade Iraq. The world, we were told, was threatened by Saddam's stockpile of weapons of mass destruction. No weapons were ever found. In the lead-up to the invasion of Iraq, Andrew Wilkie was the only Western intelligence officer to speak out.
I don't believe I could stand by any longer and take no action as this coalition marches to war.
He told a truth that everybody now admits is true. 6 years on, it's an action that he is still paying for.
A lot of people within the defence and security and public service world thought I let the team down. Some of them called me a traitor. But I believe that my loyalty was to my country, not to my government, and I believe I stayed loyal to my country during the whole affair.
Andrew Wilkie resigned to gain the freedom to speak out. If he was going to blow the whistle, he would do it the right way. He had a lot to learn. There was nothing in Andrew Wilkie's background to suggest that he may blow the whistle on his government. Private Catholic school, Royal Military College Duntroon, eventually Lieutenant Colonel in the Australian Army, then classified work at the Office of National Assessments.
I was regularly writing reports that were going straight to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister. And I enjoyed doing that. I enjoyed working on the big issues and informing the big people.
He was a keeper of secrets, a man with access to Australia's intelligence system. National Assessment's job was to advise the Prime Minister on matters of national security.
By February 2003, I was very concerned about the impending invasion. And I was very concerned to listen to the Prime Minister's speech to Parliament.
Iraq must not be allowed to possess weapons of mass destruction. For the security and stability of our world, Iraq must be disarmed.
The next day, US Secretary of State Colin Powell addressed the United Nations. It was to be the moment that the coalition of the willing turned back the tide of doubt.
Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions.
In the lead up to the war, this was the great lie.
Those men deliberately set out to mislead their audiences.
Here you see 15 munitions bunkers in yellow and red outlines. The 4 that are in red squares represent active chemical munitions bunkers. The truck you also see is a signature item. It's a decontamination vehicle in case something goes wrong.
I can still remember when Colin Powell showed grainy satellite imagery of what he said was a chemical weapons decontamination vehicle next to a WMD bunker. But in O&A we had access to the high resolution a copy of that image, and it was easily seen that it was a fire truck. I can remember the relevant branch head and the relevant senior analyst in the corridor talking about, well, where is this information? Have we seen this evidence? We need to get this evidence.
Colin Powell, the most credible man in the Bush administration, an American hero telling someone else's truth. Years later, he would regret it. By March 2003, the political pitch to the public had reached a fine-tuned finale.
We are determined to join other countries to deprive Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
Saddam Hussein has gone to elaborate lengths to build and keep weapons of mass destruction.
For Wilkie, it was a travesty. Later, in evidence to a parliamentary inquiry, his assessment was brutally blunt.
The leaders of the US, the UK and Australia lied repeatedly and unnecessarily to build support for the war they were keen to wage. They didn't need to lie. They could have been honest. They decided to go with weapons of mass destruction and terrorists, and that was a bold-faced lie, and they didn't need to do that.
2 years on from 9/11, we were all vulnerable. We were told that if they could get them, terrorists would use weapons of mass destruction. In the build-up to the Iraq War, it was billed as the clash between freedom and fear. There was never any doubt about who would win. There was only ever a doubt about the reasons for the war.
I never regarded what I did as breaking the law. By Friday morning, the 7th of March, I knew I'd run out of time. I made the decision. I won't be able to live with myself if I don't do something about this.
What troubled Wilkie was the gap between the intelligence that he was seeing and the way it was being reported to the public. Simply put,
I was witness to some of the greatest official misconduct in this country's history.
Andrew Wilkie had seen enough. He would go public, and he would make it count. He would become a whistleblower.
So I scribbled a little note, a very vague note, something about please call me out of hours and put my personal mobile number. I popped that in my diary and walked out of O&A. I drove over to the shopping centre at Deakin in Canberra, purchased an envelope from the post office, popped my business card and note into that envelope. I then went to the payphone and rang the number in the book of Laurie Oakes's home, just to double check that I had the right address.
I don't look in my letterbox every day because my mail goes to the post office, but on this night I looked in the letterbox and there was an envelope there.
In going public, Wilkie had gone straight to the top. Laurie Oakes had broken some of the most spectacular stories in Australian political history.
Friday night, I had half a dozen O&A colleagues to dinner, to Indian takeaway. 2 servings of the lamb malay korma, including the lead O&A analyst, the senior strategic analyst, who had a very pro-war view and was part of the problem, but a friend nonetheless. That's a lot of rice. And it was during that dinner that my phone rang. It was Laurie. He'd got my note.
When he answered the phone, I could hear some merriment in the background, so I knew he wasn't on his own. I didn't know much about him. The name was familiar. Turned out later that it was familiar because I'd met him at Government House a few years earlier when he'd been Bill Hayden's aide-de-camp and Bill was Governor-General. But I had no idea what he wanted to talk to me about until the next morning.
We spent an hour or so together and agreed that he would come back Sunday morning and we would go through it in more detail.
He wanted to talk to me about blowing the whistle on what he saw as the looming illegal war, and he felt very strongly about it, and he wanted to go public, and he was prepared to resign his job so that he could do it in a principled way. He didn't want to do it in a covert way. He was giving up everything because he thought it was important.
I was doing this in an extraordinary environment. Australia is about to join in the invasion of another country. I'm accusing the government of official misconduct, unprecedented in Australia's history. Arguably, I am committing a criminal offence talking to people about my concerns.
Australia has over 500 separate laws with secrecy provisions. For would-be whistleblowers, perhaps we are the unlucky country.
The Howard government became consummate at trying to exercise an ever tighter level of control over who knew what when, or who didn't know what when, or who could pretend not to know what when, and really transformed it into a high art.
There is a certain vigour when you're newly in office to be as open as possible, but as time moves on you find inevitably there seems to be a need for more and more secrets.
Over that weekend, Oakes and Wilkie meet and soon get down to business.
I've met a lot of whistleblowers and I've got leaked information from a lot of people, and sometimes they're quite obsessed people. Wilkie wasn't like that at all.
Laurie starts the interview by offering to tear up his notes and walk away. He cautions me that the lot of a whistleblower in Australia is normally a pretty awful lot. But by that stage there was no turning back. Nothing had changed. If anything, we were one day closer to invading a country for fraudulent reasons.
I wasn't careful about what I discussed with him. I had to be careful about what I wrote as a result of those discussions. I mean, the Crimes Act's pretty horrendous. It all had to be, at least in the guise of opinion. Otherwise, you went for a row, and I think 7 years jail was the term mentioned to me. It cheered me up no end.
The 7 years that Oakes refers to is the jail penalty that can be imposed on a journalist who publishes government information passed on by a public servant or a former public servant without authorization. The Crimes Act is an extraordinary piece of World War I legislation, left over from an era when loose lips sunk ships.
The problem at the moment is that the Commonwealth Crimes Act just has a blanket, in effect a blanket prohibition on releasing any information, and there's no recognition of a public interest defence, or that it might, in some circumstances, it might be reasonable or appropriate.
Ordinary public servants are constantly and daily in breach of that legislation, even simply by talking to colleagues next to them when they haven't been authorised to pass on the information that they've gathered in the course of their official duties. And when they go home at night to talk to their spouses about what they did at work, most of them are in contempt of the Crimes Act.
As a public servant, Wilkie was forbidden from revealing any information about why he thought the Iraq War was wrong. However, the Crimes Act does allow a public servant to express an opinion, providing he resigns. And that gave him and Oakes just enough room to move.
Ultimately, decisions about whether or not charges are laid in this kind of sphere are subject to political influence and subject to the government of the day.
Wilkie's plan was to make such a big splash that it would be difficult for the government to take action. Oakes was writing the cover article for the coming week's Bulletin magazine. He and Wilkie would be lead story on the Channel 9 news.
By Tuesday, the Bulletin's being printed. I am locked in, and I'm pretty scared.